Welcome everybody to Question of the Week. This is a Facebook Live session where I take on your science faith questions. Mondays, 9:30 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, 12:30 in the afternoon for those of you on the East Coast. This week's broadcast is a special broadcast where I'll be taking on the question, can chemical evolution explain the origin of life? This will give me an opportunity to report on the 18th International Conference on the Origin of Life held this past week at UC San Diego. Hugh Ross and I attended that conference, and this is a chance for me to report on the latest insights coming from the scientific community regarding the origin of life problem, the origin of life question. This past week, while I was at the Origin of Life conference, I posted updates on my Facebook page describing some of the topics that were being discussed at the conference, and then also offered some links to articles that I had written that are available on our website that address those specific topics from a Christian perspective. And in the course of doing that, my friend Steve McRae offered comments and questions on the validity of the Miller-Urey experiment and on the implications of the creation of self-replicating protocell systems. And so I'd like to take on Steve McRae's comments as well. Just as an aside, just as a sidebar, Steve McRae is somebody that you may want to get to know. Those of you who are interested in these Facebook Live broadcasts might be interested in a project that Steve McRae and some of his friends are involved in. This is called the Great Debate Program that's part of the Great Debate community. It consists of people from a wide range of religious and philosophical perspectives that like to debate and discuss science, faith, science philosophy, and scientific issues. And for many of you, this would be a great opportunity for you to offer your perspective on these particular topics. So I would encourage you to go to Google Hangout. It's a Google Hangout group, and look up the Great Debate Community and subscribe to that particular program. Steve, I would invite you, if you're watching this, to go ahead and put links in the comment section of this broadcast for how people can connect with the Great Debate Program and the Great Debate community. And afterwards, what I'll do is send out separate Facebook posts and a tweet with those links, again, encouraging people to get involved in the discussions that you are carrying out as part of the Great Debate community. I should let you know that Steve McRae is an agnostic/atheist, but I really count him as a friend and like engaging with him because he is fair-minded and he's interested in promoting genuine dialogue and discussion on these issues in a civil manner. And so I would encourage those of you who really like these kind of conversations to check out what Steve McRae is doing. His work there is exemplary and is inspirational to me as I try to create environments on my Facebook pages, both my public figure page and my personal page, where people can discuss science faith issues without any kind of censorship, where people can air perspectives that are different than mine without feeling like those perspectives are going to be dismissed or not going to be properly engaged. For those of you that do comment on my Facebook posts, I read those comments. I love to respond to them if I would have the time, but I simply don't. And so I do the best that I can, but I can't get to everybody's comments or everybody's questions. But it doesn't mean that I don't value them. It doesn't mean that I don't read them. It doesn't mean that I don't consider what you're saying, because that influences articles that I write and other broadcasts and podcasts that I do. So you are being heard, even if I can't respond to everybody. Also, if you're watching this broadcast, go ahead and take a moment to offer your perspective on the origin of life question, whether it agrees or disagrees with me. React to the broadcast using the like button. Let us know how we can improve the broadcast. That information is valuable to us. And then finally, please check in. Say hi. Let us know that you're watching, where you're watching from. This is all valuable information for us to have. And the more likes and the more comments we get, the greater the visibility this broadcast has in other people's Facebook streams. And so this helps us to get this program more broadly distributed. So by sharing this, by liking this, by commenting on this, you are really helping us out. And we also, again, want to know who you are and what your thoughts are on these issues. In fact, the last time we did a broadcast, which sadly was in June, my friend Brian Brock from Fayetteville, North Carolina, checked in during the live broadcast. Alan Ruppel from Abu Dhabi checked in. Ian Barnett from the United Kingdom, and Carl Kreisco from North Wales. And then also the recorded broadcast, we had people checking in, including Cliff Wilson from Colorado Springs, Dan Steensland from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He's part of the RTB chapter in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And then Ebenezer Samuel from India. So very much appreciate you taking the time to check in, to say hi, and I would encourage others of you to do the same thing as well. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm not going to be able to provide a comprehensive report on this conference, this Origin of Life conference. What I hope to do is just give you a little bit of a sense for what this conference was about, why it was important, we felt, for Hugh and I to attend this conference, and just some of my preliminary reactions to some of the topics that were being discussed at this Origin of Life conference. Now, I should point out that this conference is held every 3 years. It is the premier Origin of Life conference for scientists working on the origin of life problem, where the goal is try to explain the origin of life from a chemical evolutionary perspective. These are top-tier scientists who are devoting their academic careers to the origin of life question, and they gather every 3 years to present their latest work coming out of their laboratories. So if you want to go to the cutting edge of the cutting edge when it comes to origin of life research, this is the conference that you want to go to. There's material that's being presented at this conference that will not show up in journal articles until anywhere from 1 to 3 years after this conference and after the results are presented at the conference. So you're getting information that's beyond the cutting edge when you go to these conferences. There are small, intimate conferences. There's about 250 people that attended this conference this past week at UC San Diego. And that intimacy is unusual for a scientific conference, which means you get a chance to meet and to know and to interact with people throughout the course of the week. And there was a lot that was designed into the programming of the conference to allow for those interactions. And Hugh Ross and I had some incredible conversations with Origin of Life researchers about their work, about the work that we're doing at Reasons to Believe, about our perspective on the origin of life question, about what we see to be scientific challenges to the origin of life question, and found people to be remarkably receptive, remarkably open to what we had to say. We experienced no hostility. At no point in time did I feel like I was unwanted, unwelcomed. I felt very much comfortable hanging out with these scientists this past week. It was an intense conference. It went from early in the morning until late at night. Morning, noon, and night, there were presentations going on that were highly technical in nature, as you can imagine. It was an opportunity for me to geek out on prebiotic chemistry. I was in my element, but when the week was ended, I was exhausted. I was completely worn out and spent most of yesterday afternoon napping, just trying to recover from this past week's exciting activities at ISSOL 2017. So why take a week out of our very busy schedules to hang out with origin of life researchers. Why is this question so important that would merit this kind of time investment on our part? Well, I think it's safe to say that even though many of these scientists were working on this origin of life problem strictly from a scientific standpoint, at least a few of them appreciated the theological implications of the work that they were doing. The origin of life question ultimately connects to a larger question, and that is, what is our place as human beings in the cosmos? And this was really driven home, I thought, in a very elegant way by Uli Mueller, who was the president of the local organizing committee at UC San Diego and at Scripps that helped to organize and to host and to pull off this conference, this Origin of Life conference. And given that he was the president of the local organizing committee, he was given the platform as the host for the conference, which allowed him to present the opening address Sunday evening to the conference. And he concluded his time by saying this, that really, I think, set the stage in a beautiful way for the conference. He said, it's remarkable that here we are at this time in human history with the capacity to begin to understand how life originated. And of course, he's thinking about this from an evolutionary perspective. He argues it's even more remarkable to think that as human beings, we are descendants of these very first prebiotic materials that formed on the early earth that reacted and became more complex, producing the building blocks of life that then in turn reacted to form micelles and vesicles and polymeric material that began to interact and co-evolve to produce chemical supersystems that led to the very first protocells that eventually evolved towards more complex systems that we could consider the very first life forms on Earth that through an evolutionary process produced LUCA, the last universal common ancestor that anchors the evolutionary tree of life. And that from LUCA, all life on Earth descends, including human beings. And here we are, 4 billion years later, now as the product of this evolutionary history, being able to contemplate the process in which life originates. Now, of course, again, Uli Mueller is operating from within an evolutionary paradigm as he says these words, but the theological implications of the work that's being presented at the conference became very apparent to people as, again, they realized that this work that they're doing does indeed have broader implications for how we understand who we are as human beings and where we fit in the cosmos. And we could spend hours unpacking the statement that Uli Mueller made. And one thing that I can't resist pointing out is I think he makes a very powerful argument actually for the Christian view of humanity, the idea that we are not only unique but exceptional as human beings in the fact that we are even able to ponder our own existence and that we're able to develop the tools to actually probe different ways in which life and ultimately human beings came into being. That is a property, a capability that is unique to human beings. There's no other creature alive today that even comes close to having that capability. No other creature, including Neanderthals, had that capability. It's only human beings that have that ability. And that ability, it was clearly evident from the very beginnings of our origins based on the fossil and the archaeological records. But again, I think Mueller is making indirectly a very powerful argument for human exceptionalism in a way that lines up with the biblical concept of the image of God. But this highlights again why we wanted to be at this conference. And of course, from an apologetic standpoint, particularly if you're interested in evangelism, the origin of life question is really very important. Because I can't tell you how many people I meet who've taken biology classes in high school or in college who hear that chemical evolution can explain the origin of life, and conclude, if that's the case, then why do I need a creator? It undermines the notion of God's existence. I met somebody this summer who's actually one of our board members at Reasons to Believe, someone who is a chemical engineer with an advanced degree in chemical engineering, who spent his career working in the pharmaceutical industry in research and development, working in biotechnology later on, who came to faith in Christ as an adult. But one of the things that kept him from entertaining the Christian faith is the idea that chemical evolution could explain the origin of life. He was familiar with the Miller-Urey experiment and again concluded, if chemical evolution can explain the origin of life, why do we need a creator? This was a view that I held when I was an undergraduate student as an agnostic. As I learned in my biology courses, again, the chemical evolutionary scenario for the origin of life, I wasn't motivated to consider the possibility of God's existence. It wasn't until graduate school where I became convinced that the origin of life could not be explained through the outworkings of chemistry and physics that I became convinced that there had to be a creator. And that opened me up to the gospel, to hearing and responding to the gospel, because I wondered at that point, who is that creator? How do I relate to that creator? And the answer, in my view, was found in the Christian faith and in the gospel specifically. But I had friends when I was an undergraduate who were Christians who shared the gospel with me, but they had no impact on me, at least immediately, because I thought the ideas that they were presenting were ridiculous. It's hard to entertain the gospel if you don't believe that there is a creator that brought the universe and life into existence. And while I respect people who are Jesus first people when it comes to sharing their faith, frankly, I think that approach has limitations, particularly if you're engaging people who are influenced by the scientific paradigms that are prevalent in our world today. So anyway, the point here is that this is a very important question when it comes to our place in the cosmos and when it comes to our work as Christians, defending the faith and presenting the gospel. Now, another reason for attending this conference, in addition to being exposed to cutting-edge ideas in origin of life research, is that it really helps us at Reasons to Believe to truly understand what origin of life researchers are actually presenting when they make a case for chemical evolution. Our sense is that if the origin of life is going to be truly part of our creation model, if we're truly going to critique this model, that we need to do our homework. We need to be among the best of the best, hearing in a fair, unbiased way their ideas and looking at the evidence that they present in favor, in support of their ideas before we even go into the process of critiquing the origin of life. And sad to say, many Christians, when it comes to critiquing origin of life research, when it comes to the evolutionary paradigm, don't do their homework. They don't put in the effort to understand first and then to critique second. They simply jump to the critique without really understanding the ins and the outs of what that paradigm is actually saying. What are the latest ideas? What are the consensus ideas? What is motivating these researchers? What is the evidence that they have? And who are they as people? One of the things that's so valuable about these conferences is you get to know who the main players are, what motivates them, what interests them. You get to see them as human beings. You get to interact with them as human beings. And that dramatically impacts the way that you go about critiquing their ideas, that you don't view them anymore as these faceless enemies of the faith, but rather as human beings who are just like you and me. And that is something that's so invaluable. And, sad to say, some of the most prominent arguments against the origin of life espoused by Christian apologists sadly are straw man arguments, and it becomes readily apparent that these arguments are straw man arguments when you go to these origin of life meetings, or if you spend any time reading the origin of life literature with, again, an open mind towards what the origin of life researchers are actually espousing. So for us, this is very valuable in terms of setting the tone and for us to identify really the places to press on the origin of life paradigm. You know, it's interesting because when we were at this conference, Hugh Ross and I had an opportunity on many instances to sit down and have lunch and have dinner with origin of life researchers. And they would ask us, well, where are you from? What is your interest in the origin of life? And we would tell them that we work for Reasons to Believe. We'd tell them a little bit about the organization and why we were at the conference, emphasizing that we are looking at kind of the crossroads of philosophy, theology, and science when we look at the origin of life question. And to our surprise, we had incredible conversations with these origin of life researchers who were open to what we had to say, who were willing to engage us because it was evident to them that we're making the effort to understand the science behind the origin of life, and that we actually understood the science and were able to discuss things at a high scientific level. And they were open to what we had to say. And one of the things that really is surprising to me is that many of these origin of life researchers, though they would identify themselves as atheists, are atheists by default. One of my Facebook friends, Rick Viduka, asked a question last week, or maybe made a comment as he was asking the question, as I was posting updates about the Origin of Life conference. He asked the question, are these origin of life researchers extreme atheists? And what prompted that question was the fact that I noted that it's now become consensus that life appeared very early in Earth's history at 3.8 billion years ago, maybe even earlier than that, around 4.1 or 4.2 billion years ago. And of course, this very first life on Earth was photoautotrophic, as well as chemoautotrophic and heterotrophic. They're stromatolites that date at 3.8 billion years ago, and stromatolites represent complex microbial ecologies where there's a variety of different lifestyles represented in these stromatolite communities. This is very complex life that would appear very early in Earth's history. In 2002, which was the last Origin of Life conference that Hugh and I attended in Oaxaca, Mexico, there was actually a debate as to whether or not this evidence for life on Earth at 3.8 billion years ago, 3.5 billion years ago, was bioauthentic, or whether it was due to abiotic processes, where there was really a genuine split in the Origin of Life research community. Today, 15 years later, the consensus is life really did appear very early in Earth's history. It's unequivocal now, and of course the implications are that there's not a very large window of time for life to originate when you look at what the fossil record is telling us. And so Rick Viduka's response was, are these extreme atheists that they're not able to appreciate the problems that this rate causes, that this elicits? And of course, the answer to that question is no. I didn't encounter anybody that I would consider to be an extreme atheist. Many of these people were atheists by default, meaning that they hadn't really thought about these questions. When we mentioned that we like to look at the origin of life question from a scientific, theological, and philosophical standpoint, almost invariably the response we got was, well, we're scientists. We just think about this question scientifically, meaning we think about this question in an evolutionary framework, and we just see science and religion as two completely different spheres of knowledge. We don't have anything wrong with religion. We just aren't religious people. We're just interested in the scientific explanation. And of course, given the influence of methodological naturalism, that means an evolutionary explanation for the origin of life. But they've not thought about these issues beyond what the scientific data is saying to them. These origin of life researchers are a lot of fun to be around, by the way. They are a different breed of scientist. Most scientists love to solve problems. That's what brings scientists into the scientific fold. But most scientists, as much as they enjoy solving problems, they want to get to the solution. They want to figure out how things work. And that's what motivates them. Origin of life researchers are a different breed, because for them, it's not solving the problem, it's the process of going through problem solving that excites them. It's the journey, not the destination, that they really enjoy. They love the fact that the origin of life problem is this mystery of mysteries. It's an intractable problem, scientifically speaking. It means that there's no end to the speculation they can engage in. It's no end to the types of questions they can ask. It's like they are in a candy store where the candy aisles go on forever and ever and ever, and they can sample things throughout the store as much as they would like and never run out of new types of candies to try. They are so excited about the process that they're not interested necessarily in the fact that the origin of life problem still remains unresolved, and the prospects of resolving it are very dismal in the near future, even in the distant future. That doesn't bother them. They're just so enamored with the process. They're imaginative, they are creative, they are insightful, and they are top-notch scientists who are doing incredible work trying to understand how chemical evolution might proceed. It's science at its very best at these conferences, and they're so enamored in the science itself that they don't think about theological issues or philosophical issues that their data is raising. They don't think in those terms. It's like somebody who's a drug addict who their whole existence is about getting that next dose of that drug, or somebody who's addicted to a really cool video game where all they want to do is play that video game, and that game has a set of rules, and you play that game within that set of rules, which is what these scientists do. And the set of rules is methodological naturalism, and they are just so fascinated with what is happening in that game that they're playing that they cannot think beyond that game. In other words, they're not extreme atheists, they are default atheists, and surprisingly, they're very intrigued and very open to philosophical and theological issues. As long as they think that you understand what they are doing, as long as you understand their motivation, as long as you respect the work that they're doing, and that as long as they're convinced that you understand the science behind it and why they say what they say, they're happy to talk about the problems and acknowledge the problems with you. I found the origin of life research community to be extremely skeptical, believe it or not, about ideas that one another were presenting and possible solutions to the origin of life problem. They were incredibly skeptical, not only skeptical of other people's ideas, they were self-skeptical, skeptical about their own ideas. This is exemplary for how science should actually proceed, and that may surprise many of you. They are committed to an evolutionary explanation. They are convinced that evolution explains the origin of life, but they're not extreme atheists. Their atheism isn't motivating the work. They're just, have a very, I think, a very simplistic view of the relationship between science and religion, science and philosophy. And out of that simplistic view, they essentially default to the fact that they're scientists, and this is how scientists view the world, and this is how I'm viewing the origin of life problem. And as a result, I'm an atheist, but they've not thought about the issues. And so I think this community is far more open than you might expect to ideas related to intelligent design and creationism. What they do not have a stomach for are misrepresentations of their work or people bringing to the table really myopic ideas from intelligent design and from creationism. And unfortunately, what most of these scientists have seen coming from creationists, coming from intelligent design people, are actually ideas that are nothing more than straw man arguments against the evolutionary paradigm. So this is, I think, something that we all need to take to heart as we engage the scientific community and those people influenced by origin of life researchers. One of the highlights for me of the conference was the Wednesday evening panel discussion, where the question was, 64 years after the Miller-Urey experiment, has the building block problem been solved? This was a veritable who's who of origin of life researchers that took part in the panel. The chairman was Antonio Lascano, a very well-known origin of life researcher who was close friends with Stanley Miller. In addition to that, the panel consisted of Donna Blackmund, who is one of the world's leading authorities on the origin of homochirality, Jack Szostak, a Nobel laureate, who's working on self-replicating RNA systems and self-replicating vesicles, and Steve Benner, who's trying to develop alternative genetic systems to RNA and DNA, and then finally Nicholas Hudd, who is a very well-known prebiotic chemistry researcher as well. And to a person, they all agreed that we've not solved the building block problem. In fact, Steve Benner said, I'm not even sure that we've solved the problem where prebiotic molecules come from. So 64 years after Miller did his famous experiment, we still have no real explanation for the origin of life question, let alone where do prebiotic materials come from, where do building block materials come from. These are still open-ended questions that the origin of life community needs to wrestle with. One of the things that's rather interesting is that Antonio Lascano, in his opening remarks, pointed out that a month prior to Miller's paper in Science, 1953, in May of 1953 in Science, was where he presented his work generating prebiotic materials from a simulated early Earth's atmosphere. A month earlier, in April of 1953, in Nature, Watson and Crick published the structure of DNA. And here we are, 64 years later, on the verge of a revolution in molecular biology with the CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology, and yet we still don't even know where building blocks came from when it comes to the origin of life question. One of the things that I did, as I mentioned this panel on my Facebook page, is I posted a couple of articles where I talked about the Miller-Urey experiment in 2008, just shortly after Stanley Miller had died. And one of the things that I pointed out in that article is that the Miller-Urey experiment is irrelevant to the origin of life question. That the conditions that Miller used in his experiment to simulate the early Earth's atmosphere are not the conditions that we now know existed on the early Earth. And in fact, if you use the conditions that we now believe existed on the early Earth in a Miller-type experiment, you get nothing. Nothing is produced. And the reason is because we think that the early Earth's atmosphere was oxidizing, and in an oxidizing atmosphere, prebiotic materials are not produced. You have to have a reducing atmosphere, and most people don't think the atmosphere of the early Earth was reducing. Therefore, I argued the results of the Miller-Urey experiment are irrelevant to the origin of life question. And in fact, most people at the conference would probably agree with that statement. But in response to that point, my friend Steve McRae, and I'm going to pull up his comments precisely here, said this: how was Miller's experiment invalid when the experiment was to determine if carbon compounds could be formed from adding energy to a system filled with what they thought was a primordial atmosphere? It did just that. What did the textbooks get wrong exactly then? Granted, the whole primordial soup is very 1970s, while in 2017, modern views tend to more life starting near hydrothermal vents. And I would point out that the idea of life prebiotic materials being delivered from extra terrestrial sources, comets and meteorites, and hydrothermal vents, both are in vogue today. Both have some very real technical problems associated with them. We still don't know where prebiotic materials come from. I do think Steve actually makes a very important point, because Miller's experiment is considered to be the inaugural experiment in the Origin of Life research program, because he did show that in principle, simple gaseous molecules under primitive Earth-like conditions could generate organic materials that could kickstart an origin of life process. And so while his experiment is invalid and it's irrelevant to the origin of life question, it is still a very important experiment that has set the pace for the origin of life research community. And there were so many talks that I heard on prebiotic chemistry where there was some revisiting of the Miller-Urey experiment in some capacity. That experiment looms large even today, and in that sense, it's a very important scientific accomplishment, though irrelevant to the origin of life question. And this really was a theme that was an undercurrent in the conference is that even though some very interesting work in prebiotic chemistry is taking place in laboratory settings that seem to identify and elucidate principles that are critical to some kind of chemical evolution, it's questionable whether or not those processes would ever happen under the conditions of the early Earth. That is, in a laboratory setting, researchers have the capacity to control the experimental design in such a way to ensure the success of the experiments, but as soon as you remove that control and the researcher involvement in those experiments, and you now think about the conditions of the early Earth that are uncontrolled, that don't benefit from the input of an intelligent agency, it's hard to envision how those chemical and physical processes could be productive towards the origin of life. That was an underlying theme that I'm going to revisit in just a minute with respect to Steve McRae's other comment on self-replicating vesicle systems or self-replicating protocellular systems. But the bottom line is, one of the things that, again, I thought to be rather significant about the conference is that there is not, again, any real progress that I see over the course of 15 years. In 2002, Hugh Ross and I attended the same type of conference in Oaxaca, Mexico. And in 1999, I attended a conference on the origin of life at UC San Diego, the same conference. So this conference for me was almost like coming full circle, if you will. One of the very first things I did when I joined Reasons to Believe was to drive down to UC San Diego to attend that conference. And what I learned at that conference and in the 2002 conference was the framework for the book Origins of Life that Hugh Ross and I co-authored. And also some of that insight makes its way into my book, Creating Life in the Lab, published in 2011 by Baker Books. But the bottom line is that over 15 years, what I was seeing was the same questions being asked, the same types of experiments being performed, the same kind of results being generated, the same types of wrestling and trying to make sense of those results by the research community that was interested in what was being done. That is, there's no substantial progress that's been made in 15 years towards the origin of life question whatsoever. A lot of work has been done. It's very good work. It's high quality work, but I don't see any kind of real progress. The same problems that existed in 2002 exist today. Where does phosphorus come from? Where does, to support the generation of organic phosphates? How do we explain the origin of homochirality? Can ribozymes generate self-replicating systems, genetic systems? What were the conditions of the early Earth's environment? How do we translate what we're seeing in the laboratory to the early Earth? Are hydrothermal vents legitimate places for the origin of life? Is the atmosphere, are volcanic emissions? Can comets be delivered to Earth? And how do we handle the idea that there's going to be destruction as comets and meteorites pummel the early Earth? These are the same questions in 2002 and in 1999 that are being addressed today. In fact, you could take papers that were presented today and have presented them 15 years ago, 18 years ago, and they would not have been out of place. And you could take presentations I heard 15 years ago, 18 years ago, and presented them today, and they simply wouldn't be out of place. There's no real progress, which means that the material that we see in the book Origins of Life and the material in Creating Life in the Lab is still a valid, relevant critique of the evolutionary paradigm. Now, one of the things that I also noted at this conference was how valuable, if I may say so myself, how valuable the framework was that I presented in Creating Life in the Lab to assess work in prebiotic chemistry. That framework is really helpful in recognizing where origin of life researchers have been successful and where they fail, and why their failure, in my view, is intractable, is an intractable failure, and why the work that they're doing, ironically, actually points to the necessary role of intelligent agency in the origin of life. And my framework is this, that when it comes to doing prebiotic chemistry experiments, origin of life researchers are interested in three goals. The first is trying to understand the principles that would undergird chemical evolution. In other words, origin of life researchers have a number of different models for how life originates. And within those models, there's a number of different steps and sub-steps that have to take place, that have to transpire for that model to be valid. And if those steps and sub-steps are going to happen, then certain chemistry, certain physics must exist. And so a lot of the work that I saw at this conference in 2002 and 1999 were what I would call proof of principle experiments. One of the key steps, for example, in the transition of the RNA world to the DNA protein world envisioned by origin of life researchers is the emergence of proteins. Well, there's a number of studies that pointing out that peptides, oligopeptides, amino acids can actually serve as cofactors to help ribozymes catalyze a wide range of very interesting reactions that would be necessary to support the RNA world. And so the thought is that if indeed there was a transition from the RNA world to the DNA protein world, maybe the first step would be the production of proteins, and that because these peptides would exist in the early Earth environment because of the production of amino acids, maybe their first role was a cofactor. So showing in the lab that ribozymes can have their catalytic activities augmented by amino acids, by dipeptides, by oligopeptides is a proof of principle that seems to support that particular model for the origin of life. And the researchers in these studies do a masterful job of just teasing out every detail of the mechanisms that are involved in these kind of catalytic assists in this particular case. So they've understood proof of principle. The second goal is to understand mechanism. And then the third goal is to understand the geochemical relevance. And this is where there's a gigantic breakdown, I think, is very few origin of life researchers, even today, will actually look at how does the work they do in the lab translate to the conditions of the early Earth. They don't pay much attention to that other than to acknowledge that this is a concern and maybe offer some comments on prebiotic relevance of what they're doing. But until you can show that the chemistry in the lab translates to the conditions of the early Earth, you never are going to solve the origin of life problem. This is why I think it's ultimately an intractable problem, why the chemical evolutionary framework is a failed framework, and it's doomed to failure. You're never going to solve the origin of life problem this way. And in addition to that, what it also points out is that the researchers are playing a critical role in this process. And this became really apparent because there was an afternoon of about 10 or 12 talks where scientists were looking at the origin of compartments, namely vesicles, that could encapsulate material and represent the very first protocells. Very elegant experiments showing that vesicles will form under certain laboratory conditions, that those vesicles, when they go through cycles of hydration, rehydration, will form lamellar sheets that create these spaces between the sheets that serve to concentrate reactants. That's the membrane bilayers can partition hydrophobic materials. The surface, inner and outer surfaces can serve as catalytic can serve as catalysts. That these vesicles will grow when more lipid materials are added. They'll reach a point where they become unstable. They fissure, and as they fissure, not only is the composition of the vesicle wall partitioned in a steady state sense to the daughter vesicles, but so is the contents. And if you add peptides or proteins, it stabilizes the growth and fissuring of the vesicles. If you have genetic material in there, you can get that genetic material to make copies of itself in the interior of these membranes, and you can get this growth and fissuring process to divide the genetic material among the daughter cells. Really elegant work that highlights in principle many of the processes we would need to go from chemicals to protocellular systems actually exist, that the laws of physics and chemistry allow for the origin of life. The problem is that these experiments highlight the critical role of intelligent agency. These vesicles will not form on the early Earth because they won't form under high salt conditions that would have existed in the early Earth's oceans. High salt conditions inhibit the growth of RNA chains on clay surfaces. In fact, they inhibit the binding of ribonucleotide subunits onto clay surfaces. These were papers that were presented at these conferences or in the Origin of Life literature. So you have to have pure water environments on the early Earth for even vesicles to form. And their composition has to be exact, it has to be precise in order for these vesicles to grow and divide. You have to very carefully choose the lipids as well as the conditions of the solution. You have to choose the right types of peptides. You have to choose the right types of genetic material. You have to have vesicle-vesicle fusion to feed nutrients to that system so that it can be a self-sustaining protocellular replicating system. And so for me, what it's highlighting is that these processes are never going to emerge on the early Earth, and that intelligent agency is critical. That is, apart from an intelligent agency, you're not going to have an origin of life. And in response to that, again, my friend Steve McRae, said this. Let me read his words precisely here. Okay, here we go. Steve says this: synthetic biology is fascinating, and you're right that different people can reach vastly different conclusions based upon these self-replicators. But by what specific method do we have to conclude the ID hypothesis over a teleonomic one, which would mean a hypothesis that it employs the appearance of design, not genuine design? So it'd be the counterpart to an ID model, a teleological model. There would have to be some type of empirical evidence which would sway one as being slightly more problematic as an abductive inference to the best explanation, assuming prior observations of design from a non-natural agent. I think that is where the main crux of the problem lies. What is the piece of information that allows us to say which explanation is better and more parsimonious with existing knowledge and experience versus just going by one's visceral feelings or personal bias? Great question. And Steve, you hit the nail on the head. That's the question. And I would submit to you that the empirical evidence is actually the work that these Origin of Life researchers are doing. That we know empirically, time and time again, when they go in the lab, what is required to affect prebiotic chemistry. And it's highly controlled, carefully designed experimental setups that allow the chemistry to proceed. And as soon as you try to translate that chemistry into the conditions of the early Earth, you wind up with such an uncontrolled environment that there's no way that chemistry would ever be productive. And so to me, the empirical evidence is the failure to translate that chemistry into the realistic conditions of the early Earth. Anyway, I've gone on long enough, maybe way too long. There will be more that Hugh and I will be sharing about the 18th International Conference on the Origin of Life. We've already been talking about going into the studio and doing a podcast for probably free distribution, just again discussing some of the technical details about what was presented at the Origin of Life conference. And I'm sure things that we heard at the conference will make their way into blog articles, into podcasts, and perhaps even into future books. I've already got a book idea based on some things that I saw at the Origin of Life conference, a brand new approach to making a case for design that intersects between intelligent design and Origin of Life research. But I just want to close by saying this, that I think the Origin of Life problem is a great place for Christian apologists to focus on. That this is a place where the evolutionary paradigm clearly has failed, and I think will continue to fail. I think this idea infuses our culture and influences people towards rejecting the gospel are having a hard time truly entertaining the gospel. But I think it's very important that we do not misrepresent origin of life researchers, that we don't mischaracterize them, that we take the effort to truly understand the work that they're doing, the evidence in favor of their work, that we don't erect straw man arguments that are easy to knock down, that we properly represent their work, and we properly identify the places that represent genuine scientific problems. And if we do that, I think we're going to find that we're going to get a much broader, more sympathetic audience to our concerns and to our case for a creator than what I currently see when I look at what was happening in Christian apologetics today. One of the reasons why I am so sour on the idea of irreducible complexity and some of the ways in which I hear the information argument being made by Christian apologists is because I've been at these meetings, because I'm reading the origin of life research literature with an open mind, and I see how these arguments are missing the point, how they're misrepresenting the scientific community, and we're doing nothing but alienating people who would otherwise, I think, be intrigued and maybe even open and responsive to what we have to say from an intelligent design framework. But the bottom line is that the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. And for me, after spending a week at UC San Diego at this Origin of Life meeting, that statement rings more true than before I attended that conference. And so I just want to close by saying God bless each and every one of you. I'm so grateful for your interest in Reasons to Believe and your interest in what I do at Reasons to Believe and your interest in these Facebook Live sessions. Please share this. Please comment, offering your perspective on the origin of life question. Steve, I hope if you're watching this that you give us a link to the Great Debate community. I would love for you to react to the broadcast, like it, offer us ways in which we can improve the broadcast. This is all valuable information to us. And again, until next time, the more that we know about science, the more that we have reasons to believe. Again, God bless you.